Hey guys, it's Khalil,
Hey, it's Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. All right, so starting our part six, I think it is, for this ethno-nationalism special series, um, we are we are starting to move away from the much more um, from the obvious examples of Hitler and Mussolini, as well as from our first episode of defining the concepts that make up ethnicity and nationalism, and ethno-nationalism, and the different types of nationalism that align more with ethno-nationalism, as well as our 2, 3 episodes we spent bashing Putin on his illogical description, justification for his actions in Ukraine, um, and really making it clear to you that he is not on the side of truth. Now that we're done with that, though, um, we wanted to move to other modern, equally obvious, sometimes more obvious examples of ethno-nationalists since the end of the Cold War, and some even acting in their ethno-nationalist agenda today.
Yep. And so with this one, with the first world leader that we're going to be looking at and examining is a man by the name of Slobodan Milosevic. So Milosevic was the leader of what was once was Yugoslavia, but primarily the himself he was a Serb, I believe, and he led the state of Yugoslavia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And throughout the Yugoslavia's various wars in the 1990s, he led a rise in Serbian nationalism, which ended up becoming a sort of ethno-nationalism through conflict uh, led towards ethnic cleansing of groups such as Albanians. And so yeah, in the 90s, after the Soviet Union dissolved, the state of Yugoslavia was formed out of various different republics, and Yugoslavia had many different ethnicities all bound together under one state. And because of that, that makes, negotiating who's going to have a country, who's going to lead this area, who's going to be a governor, this, that, whatever, it made that very difficult. So Milosevic, after the dissolution, he was wishing for a model in which the dispersed Serbian peoples, of which he was a Serb, he wanted the Serbian population to be united in a single republic, and he wanted the Serbians to obtain political influence proportional to the status as the most numerous minority in Yugoslavia. And so basically, what that means is he wanted a state of primarily Serbians and believed that that should be the most powerful one in this new state of Yugoslavia because they were the most numerous. But as I said, Yugoslavia was a very diverse country. We said that that the Serbs were the most populous minority. And so there you kind of have a plurality of all the people that are there, such as Albanians, Bosnians, um, Muslims, all that kind of stuff. And so when he was calling for that, um, that brought him into contention with other groups, such as what was it, such as Croatia and Slovenia, who kind of vying for power in this kind of power vacuum that was left. Well, like you can
Right.
go off that.
Yeah, the history of Yugoslavia is quite difficult to understand, and that's why Yugoslavia is largely left out of the picture in the typical, at least American way of teaching the Cold War, because they didn't necessarily put themselves as being part of the USSR, but they also were clearly not capitalist from the 40s to the 90s. So the founder of this Yugoslav nation, um, or one of its like longest lasting leaders from the 40s to the 80s, was the dictator Josip Broz Tito. And it was after his death, and where he reined in, and really like forcefully united all the South Slavic peoples, whether they be Croatians, Slovenians, Bosnians, um, Muslim minorities within the region, that, you know, to many in the area were believed to have their own nationality as being Muslims, and Serbs, as well as Albanians. And so um, it was after Tito's death and his long reign in office as being the dictator of Yugoslavia, Milosevic came in, and he wanted to be an equally um, pivotal and equally historically important person in Yugoslav history. Um, but so he came into power shortly after Tito's death in the 80s. But as the Iron Curtain was disestablishing itself in other parts of Eastern Europe and the USSR was weakening, his position as the leader of this Yugoslav federative nation is being questioned. As nations of Croatia and Slovenia declare their independence from the Union, and Milosevic, in a way that is quite difficult, I'll have to admit, for me to understand. He wanted to unite Yugoslavia again while also uniting the Serb peoples into one nation the way how it has been since the beginning of the establishment of the Yugoslav nation. Because the Yugoslav nation had been comprised of about 5 or 6 different republics within southeastern Europe, Croatia, Bosnia, Slovenia, Serbia, the other nations that we've already listed. Um, um, since they were all part of the same nation during the Cold War, people could kind of move freely or somewhat freely between those areas, and each one of the lines of each some different socialist republic within the Union, um, they didn't have clear ethnic borders. And so when the nations became independent, um, the the political violence that has always been shaped by the Balkans, if you know anything about European history in the 19th and 20th century, started to show up again, and the ethnic divides, really started to show up. And so Milosevic, he exploited this. In Defense Matters, this site here that you can see um, from this screenshot that we have here of an article, and where they agree with us here that he used nationalism as a political weapon, to unite the Yugoslav nation again. Um, he really did his best to be an ethno-nationalist and to again unite the Yugoslav people in this sort of Serb nationalism.
Yeah. And so one of the ways that he tried to do this is so Milosevic recognized that as Yugoslavia was in the early 90s, that 25% of Yugoslav Serbs lived outside the borders of what they were calling for Serbia to be. And so because of this, Milosevic aimed to claim that the other independent nations, such as, Bosnia, Albania, all those kind of places, that they were enacting crimes against the ethnic Serb populations in their countries. And so that Milosevic and the Serbian nation, it had to be their goal to, defend these ethnic Serbians who were within those countries. Because, these new republics were ethnically cleansing them or stopping them in the streets or shooting them or anything like that. So he used the fact that, as I said, 25% of Yugoslav Serbs lived outside of the country. And so he used that as a way to start a conflict with these other nations and to gain more land by using the justification of other Serbs not being within the country. It's a very classic narrative that you see, and it's one that we kind of outlined in our one about Putin, because he uses somewhat of the same logic in that these our ethnic populations who are outside of our borders are being victimized by these other nations, and so we have to go in and save them. This is what Milosevic really aimed to do. Um, and so he used this again as a justification for starting conflicts again with these other countries in the former Yugoslav nation, and this is where we get that conflict that simmered from, I believe, like 1992 to 99.
Right. And throughout that whole time, during the 90s, Milosevic and other Serb generals and leaders were trying to force a nation of ethnically pure Serbian people. It's again, it's a little hard to see what the aim of Milosevic is, and I suppose if you look really hard into it, I guess you could understand it. But like he was trying to create this ethnic Serb state while also uniting the Yugoslav nation. And
Seems
so
contradictory, kind of.
a little bit. Yeah, exactly. Because only 35% of all people in the Yugoslav nation were Serbs. And because there were a bunch of other different ethnic minorities within the Yugoslav nation, um, Serb people, they won out. But if you're trying to create an ethnically pure state while uniting the Yugoslav nation, then you'd have to kill 65% of everyone else living there. And that is quite a chore. So basically, what can be simplified as the Serbs, and Milosevic leading them, trying to um, force force ethnic lines, force a nation along ethnic lines, try to create, pure ethnic boundaries, which didn't exist under the larger, previously existing Yugoslav state. And that's where a lot of gruesome crimes against humanity started to show, like again these other sources here that show also what we're saying here about ethno-national identity, and the rise of ethnic nationalism right here from other universities that say the same thing, and here from another site that discusses like Balkan politics and geopolitics, Balkan Insight. They say that um, and that's really what we're leaning into with the big example of ethno-nationalist action is the ethnic cleansing campaign known as Operation Horseshoe in 1998-99, and where Milosevic really set his sights on the um, largely ethnically Albanian state known as Kosovo. Now, Kosovo is a new nation that had been created from a NATO intervention, but as you see here from the title, um, Milosevic, he had the idea of this Operation Horseshoe to cleanse Kosovo, to send all the ethnic Albanians out of Kosovo and leave the remaining ethnic Serbs within the area. And this drew the ire of um, of other Western nations within the NATO alliance, particularly the US, because Milosevic throughout the 90s had been a very um, violent guy that was provoking conflict, that was fighting for reasons that many in the world thought were not just, and purposefully targeting civilians in conflict, and a whole bunch of atrocities, and where hundreds of thousands of people died in the region. And this
Yeah,
Operation Horseshoe in 1999 seemed to be the last straw for NATO, and so they acted.
yeah. And so this plan was found out or had been kind of leaked or just discovered during Milosevic's reign. And this plan, as we kind of described, it called for the use of it was kind of, I looked over the plan. It was the using of tanks and other militaries to kind of sweep the Albanians out of Kosovo, and whether it be done by just moving them or by killing them if they weren't going to, leave. And again, this was essentially what was like the last straw in what would get the West to act. And so when these kind of plans leaked and other Milosevic's ideas became just, of course, more and more clear. That's what provoked NATO to begin its first intervention that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had ever participated in. Over its entire history, over the past 50 or so years, it hadn't, joined in the U.S. or joined in Vietnam or anything like that. And so this, which was basically ethnic cleansing on the doorstep of Europe, this was the last straw. And so, between March and June of 1999, that's where we had the NATO airstrikes. It was mainly an air superiority campaign against Serbia in the nation of Kosovo. And as I said, that was the last straw. And so between those months, they bombed the they bombed the army to smithereens, and that eventually got Milosevic to surrender. And later down the line, he was tried for war crimes and executed in, what was it, 2006?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah,
It wasn't just an air campaign. It started off as an air campaign, I believe, in 98 or so. But then in 99, Clinton announced that U.S. Forces were going to be, U.S. ground forces were going to be put down into Kosovo because of Milosevic's stubborn resistance, as well as other NATO countries. And so you had British, you had I believe what other NATO forces were
yeah.
there? But
I
just
mean, we
basically
had
NATO. You had British, Americans, other
Belgium,
nations.
Canada, France, Italy, Germany, Netherlands, Norway. Majority of the NATO countries would
Right.
join in for this fight.
So they all came and did their part in physically on the ground pushing Milosevic's forces out of Kosovo. And once they had sufficiently done so and taken the capital of Kosovo, which I'm not even gonna try to remember the capital's name. Whatever. They overran the territory, forced Milosevic out. They captured Milosevic, and tried him for war crimes. I think it was crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. I don't know if it was both, but I think I think he was actually tried and convicted of ethnic cleansing, like the crime itself of ethnic cleansing in The Hague.
Right.
And so that itself is a recognition, and the fact that he was later executed is a recognition that um, that he was an ethno-nationalist. That not only was he, a warmongering, genocidal maniac, but in the modern day, 50 years after Hitler died, but he also was an ethno-nationalist in and of himself. So, right. The next example that we have of an ethno-nationalist, which some of you might be surprised by and some of you might not, and that is Xi Jinping. So, yeah, Chad, why don't you expand on that with the Uyghur problem?
Sure. So the main reason or the main evidence for China's, and specifically under the reign of Xi Jinping, who took power in, I believe, 2013, of China's emerging ethno-nationalist policies is their treatment of the Uyghur minority group. So the Uyghurs are a Turkic people who are based in kind of southwestern China, and so throughout China's time, they have existed, and they're a smaller minority group, but they're of course, dwarfed by the Han Chinese, which is the majority of the Chinese population. Um, but throughout the history of the People's Republic of China, they've had to kind of grapple with the problem of creating a nation that still has, diverse peoples, but having a nation that has this diversity in which they still all work for for the state. Um, and so one of the things that Xi Jinping has said recently in a address to the party, like the Chinese Communist Party, was to quote discard the dross, the rubbish. It's another word for rubbish, and select the essence, weed out the chaff, and bring forth new roots when it comes to minority cultures. This is from a source we'll have in our document later down, in the description, how we always do. But this is kind of vaguely one that addresses what their mission to do with minorities is to do, and that's to kind of deal with the bad and bring out the new. Their mission is to strengthen the Chinese people and the Chinese nation, since of course China's goal is to become a world superpower and to do that through whatever means are necessary. And so another one that we had from that source is that with China's goal, with the minority, which they would probably call an issue, is to transform the thoughts and behavior of its Muslim minorities and to make these ethnic minorities love the party. And so, how do we see this happening? What we have in southwestern China in the region of Xinjiang is the um, use of what you could basically call internment camps, re-education camps, and other initiatives that are aimed that are well, essentially what they do is they move people of the Uyghur ethnic group into these camps in which they're taught Mandarin, are shown propaganda, shown Chinese history in order to kind of get them along the path of loving the Chinese Communist Party. Over the years, we've seen more and more leaks come out of these camps of people being blindfolded, beaten, um, and then some testimonies of people who have escaped or have relatives who have been sent there. And these are basically camps in which the people of this ethnic group are trying to be converted from their original culture, which is usually a Muslim culture, into the more secular and party supporting mindset that the majority of the Chinese people have.
Right. The Han Chinese ethnic group makes up over 90% of the people that live within China's borders, and so it's a very significant majority. The actually the second largest group of people in China along ethnic lines is the Uyghurs. Which only make up about 8% of the population, which in a nation as big as China is actually quite big. That's about 100 million people right there. So it's a lot of people. And so Xi Jinping noticed that, well, basically, he came to the conclusion that that regardless of the fact that that's a lot of people to control, it's that it wasn't enough to stop him from doing things we would not that we as a human race thought that we wouldn't see after World War II. And so, really, the rhetoric that he uses to describe ethnic minorities, like discard the dross and select the essence, weed out the chaff, new roots. It's very. I mean, he's not being explicit here, in this quote about like we're talking about the Uyghurs. We want them gone. We want them. We want to change their culture. We want them to be we want to create this new person out of them. So it's not openly like extermination rhetoric, in the sense that he's like calling out a particular ethnic group, but he you can definitely be interpreted as such. And the um, I also got to say that the selection of a majority Muslim Uyghur group, right here, ethnic group in Western China, is very interesting, because there is a worldwide clampdown on the Muslim religion, whether it be in India or in much of Europe or under the Trump administration for the Muslim ban and a lot of Islamophobia that have been going on since 9/11 in America, so the response to the idea that China might be interning, about 100 million or so Muslim ethnic Uyghur people, it kind of it's really confusing for a lot of people that, you know, like they put out a lot of like anti-Islam um legislation and really don't like the religion of Islam or its people that support it. Um and then see that their major geopolitical enemy is interning such people. That was the strange thing about Trump. But what's going on in those camps, some people call concentration camps in Xinjiang, is is quite horrific. I've heard different stories and different sources say that there's forced family separation, starvation, forced sterilization, um, and forced to learn the Chinese language if they don't know it. forced to go against their Muslim religion if they're Muslim, which majority of these people are, to kill off like all the memories and all the stories and traditions of not just the part of them that's Muslim and the but the part of them that is ethnically Uyghur. Um, and what else? Also torturings, beatings of children sometimes. And this was all for the intention of quote forging the zhonghua, the communal consciousness of the Chinese people that you want to create. If you're the CCP, if you're Xi Jinping, to create this sort of homogenous group of people in China that will all support the party and all support peace rather than freedom. And so we're going to talk more and more and more about this in our next main series after this one on peace v freedom. And we're going to use China as a great example. But what they're doing against the Uyghurs is not something that can simply be ignored. You can't say from all the drone footage and all the reports that have come through from there, and all the stupid denials from the CCP officials across the world when they're asked about it, that this isn't happening. It is happening. Hundreds of internment camps have been set up, and the people are are shunned and pushed away from their homes, by CCP officials when tourists come to look at their old ancient villages, and it really is quite the crime, to put it the least.
Yeah, as we said, it's something that the world didn't think it would see after World War II, and yet here we are again, right? Almost getting close to back to the same track that we had with Nazi Germany, in which we have the internment, the concentration, the erasure of an ethnicity, of a culture, and here we are, and we don't really even have too much of a world um, opposition to this. That's one of the surprising things about this is that because the nation doing this is China, one of the most powerful countries in the world now, we don't have the kind of world condemnation that we had, or believe that we had, with fascist nations such as Nazi Germany, or of repressive countries, um, or of like repressive leaders such as like Milosevic. We don't have that with China. We have a great hesitancy among world leaders to call out this ethnic. You could basically call it ethnic cleansing, in which you're erasing a nation, but ethnic
There's a
erasure.
reason for that. It's
Yeah,
really interesting because nations, they care a lot about providing for their citizens and like economic opportunities. And for a long time, nations have thought of America as being their only option. Nowadays, for nations that have a skewed, sort of complicated moral compass, they'll choose China because they don't like America or they want to have options or whatever. But when
and
they
the
do that, they
economic
actually support
benefits
a lot of this.
of China too.
Exactly. Like Milosevic, Yugoslavia was not an economically strong, must be partnered with them nation. And Hitler's Nazi Germany was not an economic powerhouse because of his principles of autarky, which we talked about earlier in a past series, and where he foregone a lot of trade. He did not take the opportunity to conduct enlarged trade between different nations, but China certainly is. It's choosing to spread its legs, to spread its growing modern imperialist view through economic means, and a lot of nations are really sucking onto that. And so, with the whole ethno-nationalist and foreign policy here, there are different sites that agree with this. We wanted to have um, screenshots of different sources that say the same thing, that agree with us, because there are quite a few if you look it up. If you look up Xi Jinping ethno-nationalist, you'll find a fair amount of different sources. We're not just making this up. The Economist says it, that he's nurturing Chinese nationalism. The Foreign Affairs asked it almost 5 years ago, before much of the internment camps have been found. there's a lot more that have been discovered and found by the West since then. China does a pretty good job at hiding it, but in the past 5 years, we know a lot more. And even back then, they were saying if Xi Jinping was adopting an ethno-nationalist foreign policy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, this isn't us just bringing up this point. This is a well-known thing, and as we said, a reason that it's not being condemned as widely as we had these smaller nations is because China is so much of a global power that so many nations are connected to it. If the European Union was to call out China and to put them on the global human rights watch, this, that, and the other, they would lose so many economic services, so much of a trade partner, um, computer chip, computer chips, all the kind of products that come out of China that the world is connected to. People feel of losing, and so that's why we have even world superpowers like us, like the United States, being a little hesitant to call them out on this because it's gonna um, it would be detrimental to us economically to do so. However, I mean, it's not really a crazy thing to say that it's the right thing to do to be calling this out because what it is it's essentially ethnic cleansing. You're erasing a whole ethnicity, a whole culture in the aims of creating a Chinese homogenous state. It's ethnic cleansing. We as a global community, it's our if we want to continue to uphold our liberal system that we've had for since the end of the Cold War and even before then, it is kind of our obligation to be calling people out on this, to protect human rights and to protect democracy. And so it's kind of a shame to see the lack of movement on this issue from Western nations, including the United States. We're guilty of this as well. Um, but yeah, so yeah, Xi Jinping is definitely, as we've said, an ethno-nationalist, and you could see this through its actions, and it's becoming more and more evident as more evidence comes out, and this is just one of them. We didn't even get to mention some of the more nationalist or just more expansionist policies that China has, with Taiwan or the South China Sea, but there's even more to that. um, and so as we kind of get to our time, um, with this episode, as we said, we wanted to look at some of um, a lesser known ethno nationalist in the post Cold War world of Milosevic, and then also look at a more modern and a very present example right now, Xi Jinping of China. And so, in our next episode, we'll be looking at another ethno nationalist who is present, but is a little less, again, another lesser known ethno nationalist, and that is Erdogan of Turkey. And it seems he seems to fly under the radar pretty often, and that's because Turkey is a NATO ally. They're part of the NATO. They're partnered with various Western nations all across the world, and so it looks a little contradictory that they may be an ethno-nationalist and yet no one seems to be batting an eye. But as we will go into in our next episode, we'll look at how his policies, his rhetoric has reflected some of these ethno-nationalist views, and we'll bring these up because I believe it's very important to recognize how this ideology is still very present after World War II and even after the Cold War, because it's not coming to an end, and in fact, it's rising. And so, even after that episode, we'll look at more leaders and examine if they are to be ethno nationalists or just nationalists or just theocratic leaders, some of which include Modi of India, Orban of Hungary, and then Duda, the leader of Poland. And so we'll be looking at them as well because once again, they are nationalist at the very least, and so we're going to be looking at if they are, in fact, ethno nationalists. And as I said, I believe it's really important that we shed a light on this um, and do so.
Right. Because again, a lot of us learning about world history and learning about people like Hitler, and to a lesser extent, Mussolini, we are largely led to believe that ethno-nationalism died with Hitler. And we believe that we have already shown you that it hasn't. It's just a question of how prevalent is it today? Is it on the rise or is it on the downturn? Do dictators feel like they have to come up with increasingly desperate ideas of of being racist, of being nationalist, you know, and that there are just more and more as time is going on that dictators are realizing that liberal democracy is the only way to function. So that's really the question that we will begin to ask, in the end of this series here. But the second part about that, with the whole like accepting that liberal democracy is the only way to function as a modern state and achieve all the great things that come out of modern civilization, we'll have to wait on that for our Peace v Freedom series, which is coming relatively soon. Should be about a week from from the time that you guys see this episode. So yeah, I hope that we've shown that Xi Jinping is an ethno-nationalist. There's a lot more sources that we wanted to just kind of read off quotes from, but we'll put it all in the description. You guys can see it. We're not the only ones saying that he is an ethno-nationalist, so we're not just pulling it out of our ass here. Um, and then we'll talk about Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and how he's persecuting an ethnic minority in his country by the name of the Kurds. And then we'll talk about Modi, the leader of India, and how he might be an ethno-nationalist or simply a religious theocratic nationalist in the way how he's persecuting Muslim people and stoking a lot of Islamophobia within his country. And then we'll also talk about other nationalist leaders where it's a little harder to say that they might be ethno-nationalist, but they're certainly on the watch about authoritarianism, whether it be Andrzej Duda of Poland and his Islamophobic immigration policies, or Orban of Hungary. And so we'll have to see.
Yeah, that's about what we have for today. Thank you for sticking by. Without further ado, we're the Marshals of Truth. We'll see you in the next episode.